Since first being developed in 1540, the rifle has been a mainstay of practically every war. When troops are on the ground, they'll always have a trusty rifle in their hands, with any other firearms being backups or special use weapons. Rifles win wars, and when it comes to two of the most important wars that America has ever been involved in, World War II and the Vietnam War, the rifles they used often made the difference between victory and defeat. That's why there was constant development of rifle technology between World War II and Vietnam, which brings us to the subject of this video. Which rifles were used in these two historic conflicts? And how did those used in the Vietnam War differ from the rifles that became emblematic during World War II? That's the question we aim to answer here. But first, a caveat. Covering every single rifle used in both wars would result in this video running for several hours and lead to discussions on rifles that made very little difference on the battlefield. Instead, we've picked a small selection of rifles, 6 from World War II and 5 from the Vietnam War. In both cases, these rifles were either the most commonly used, making them the most important, or had a special role to play in the war, even if they fell out of favor later. Let's start by looking at the 6 most important rifles of World War II. The M1 Garand. When a figure as important as General George Patton calls a rifle the greatest battle implement ever devised, you know it has to be something special. And in the M1 Garand, the United States certainly had a special rifle. Developed primarily by John Garand, the chief civilian engineer at Massachusetts Springfield Armory, the M1 was a gas-operated .30 caliber rifle that was introduced to the U.S. Army in 1936. And it had one key advantage over almost every other standard-issue rifle used in World War II. It was semi-automatic. Where other soldiers had to manually load a new round after firing, the M1 was capable of loading a fresh cartridge into the firing chamber as soon as the user fired. The result was a rifle that enabled the soldier to fire off more rounds quicker than their opponent could, as well as one that enabled the soldier to focus more on the battlefield. After all, in a shootout, the soldier who knows they have 8 rounds that'll automatically be loaded and ready to fire will always have the advantage over the one who has to stop after each round to reload. Those 8 rounds were fed into the Garand via a small clip, with the rifle itself weighing just 9.5 pounds. That made it light enough to strap over a shoulder without weighing soldiers down. As for the autoloading mechanism, the secret to that lay in a gas port located on the underside of the rifle's barrel. That port fed propellant gases into a cylinder that controlled the loading mechanism, which, along with the force of a bullet being fired out of the chamber, allowed the Garand to switch to a new round seconds after the chambered round was fired. The only small problem with the rifle came early in its development. Infamously, the first iterations of the M1 Garand tended to jam at every 7th round. The issue lay in the loading of the clip's top round. If it came in from the right, the gun would jam. But if it was loaded from the left, the rifle wouldn't jam. That served as a temporary fix while the rifle was being showcased, with a more permanent solution coming from an assistant foreman at Springfield named Walter Campbell. When examining the guide rails built into the rifle to keep the clip in place, he discovered that a small nub present on the left fore guide rail wasn't on its right side equivalent. It had been removed to fit the barrel into the M1's receiver. A switch to welding the guide rails to replace the lost nub solved the 7th round jamming problem, and the United States went on to manufacture over 5 million M1s. However, as important as the M1 Garand would prove to be, it wasn't the only rifle that helped the U.S. come out on top during World War II. The M1 Carbine. While the Garand was produced a couple of years before the start of World War II, the M1 Carbine was developed when the war was in full swing. Production started in June 1940 when the U.S. identified the need for a lighter rifle than the Garand, which could be used by support troops including medics, MPs, and officers. Basically, anybody who was considered at risk from a German attack but would be unable to shoulder a full-sized Garand needed something lighter and easier to manage. That was the M1 Carbine. Though often considered a small semi-automatic variant of the Garand, the Carbine could fire a .30 caliber Winchester round. Though that is comparable to the Garand, the Carbine was closer to a pistol than its sister rifle. It had an effective range of 300 yards, half that of the Garand, with its rounds moving at a rate of 1,900 feet per second, or FPS, compared to the Garand's 2,700. However, the Carbine could hold more rounds. It featured a detachable magazine containing 15 rounds, which could be removed and reinserted at will, with post-World War II variants of the rifle introducing the banana magazine that upped its round count to 30. At 35 inches, it was about 8 inches shorter than the Garand, with its unloaded weight of around 5.5 pounds also making it much easier to shoulder. It also used a gas-actuated loading system, which drove the slide rearward to operate the rifle's bolt, which then ejected the loaded round, followed by its casing, to allow the rifle to automatically load the next round. The rifle entered into military service in 1942, with over 6 million eventually being produced. With the 1-2 punch of the Garand and the carbine, the United States had a pair of rifles that ensured every soldier on the ground, no matter their role, could protect themselves. Of course, though America had the most impressive rifles of the war, their allies and enemies had guns of their own. And when it came to America's British and Canadian compatriots, there was a much different rifle that ruled the roost: the Lee Enfield rifle. With far more limited resources, as well as the fact that they faced a much more imminent threat from the Nazis, Britain didn't have the ability to pump money into developing fancy new semi-automatic rifles. Instead, they relied on an old faithful, the Lee Enfield rifle. Introduced in 1895, the rifle had been a key armament for Britain's Commonwealth forces, as well as itself during the height of the British Empire. Later, the rifle became standard issue for its forces during World War I, with only small variations being made before it also became standard British issue in World War II. The Lee Enfield was a bolt-action rifle fed by a 10-round magazine, meaning it held 2 more rounds than America's famous Garand. However, each round had to be loaded manually by pulling back on the rifle's bolt, leading to a lower firing rate. The Mark III version of the rifle, which was introduced in 1917, but still the rifle of choice for Brits in World War II, could fire a .303 round and had a maximum range of 2,500 yards. But don't let that maximum range fool you. According to the National Army Museum, the gun's effective killing range was about 600 yards, putting it right in line with the M1 Garand. It also fired about as quickly as any bolt-action rifle in the war. The National Army Museum claims that a well-trained soldier could fire off 15 rounds per minute, leading some Germans to believe that they were dealing with machine gun fire during World War I. That misconception was shattered by the time World War II came around, though the Enfield was still fast and reliable, enough to prove it an effective weapon. In fact, the Enfield was so trustworthy that the Bangladeshi police still issued it as standard deep into the 2000s. Still, it wasn't the only bolt-action rifle used during the war. Germany had their own, though whether it was superior to the Enfield is up for debate. The Mauser Karabiner 98K. Upon becoming Germany's chancellor, Adolf Hitler quickly chose to leave the League of Nations, followed swiftly by his announcement that he intended to expand the Wehrmacht, the German army, to a staggering 600,000 members. These soldiers would need to be armed, which led to Hitler tasking the German army's weapons developers, the Heereswaffenamt, with creating a new rifle that would become standard issue for the country's troops. The Mauser Karabiner 98K, or K98K, was the result. Introduced to the German army in 1935, the rifle quickly became the de facto choice for German troops. It used the Mauser M98 system and was a bolt-action rifle capable of holding an internal magazine carrying 5 7.92 by 57 mm rounds, roughly rounding up to 8 mm. Speaking of that bolt action, Mauser cleverly replaced the straight bolt handle seen on the Gewehr 98, Germany's previous standard issue rifle, with a turned-down handle that made it easier to quickly operate the bolt. Still, the rifle was held back by having such a small cartridge. Both the Garand and the Enfield could hold more rounds in a single clip, meaning German soldiers faced more risk of being caught with an empty gun than their Allied enemies. It made up for that shortcoming with a range of accessories. The rifle was compatible with a 9-inch S84 97-3 bayonet, making it surprisingly handy in close-quarters combat. Soldiers could also fit their SG-42 combat knives as makeshift bayonets, though these knives were in pretty short supply. And in 1942, the Germans developed the Scheissbecher, or shooting cup, grenade launcher attachment, which could fit any K98K. Add to that the ZF-41 optical sight, which added weight to the rifle but allowed it to be used similarly to a heavy scout rifle, and you had a surprisingly versatile gun. It may not have topped the rifles the Allies had at their disposal, but it is no surprise that the Soviets claimed millions of K98Ks upon the war's conclusion. Nevertheless, the Nazis knew they had to come up with a rifle that could match the semi-automatic capabilities of the M1 Garand. And with the next rifle on the list, they may have found that new gun. Though it arrived so late in the war, it wasn't capable of turning the tide in Germany's favor. The Gewehr 43. Once Hitler saw the power of the M1 Garand on the battlefield, he naturally gave the order for Germany to develop its own semi-automatic rifle. 2 guns came from this demand: the G41M from Mauser and the G41W developed by Walther Arms. Neither rifle cut the mustard, with both experiencing reliability problems that led to them jamming in combat. It wasn't until Germany invaded the Soviet Union that it got its hands on the SVT-40, Russia's semi-automatic rifle, which Walther Arms had a chance to examine. They saw that the SVT-40 used a simple and superior gas system which they were able to combine with their G41W design to create the Gewehr 43. Capable of firing 7.92 by 57mm Mauser rounds, the rifle measured 44.5 inches, making it slightly longer than the Garand, and weighed in at 9.7 pounds when it was unloaded. Importantly, it had a 10-round box magazine, allowing it to fire off 2 more shots than the Garand before reloading, though the Germans occasionally used 20-round magazines. But despite the higher capacity, the Gewehr 43 was never considered to be superior to the M1 Garand. It was certainly an improvement over the SVT-40 that inspired it, as well as being well liked by the German troops who had a chance to wield it. However, the gun didn't really meet the quality standards established by the Allies. Parts had a habit of breaking more often, with many deeming the rifle a rush job in hindsight. That's no surprise. The Germans developed it midway through the war and didn't have the time to tweak the design or manufacturing process, leading to an inferior rifle. Nevertheless, 400,000 of these rifles were produced before the Nazis fell, and though it never became Germany's counterpoint to America's semi-automatic rifles, its design did inspire rifles that came later, including one we'll cover in our Vietnam list. It couldn't quite match up to the reliability of the final rifle in our World War II list, though, the Mosin Nagant. The Soviet Union's standard-issue rifle had several parallels with Britain's Lee Enfield rifles. Like the Enfield, the Mosin Nagant was created during the late 19th century, entering into service in 1891, 4 years before the Brits developed the Enfield. It was a bolt-action rifle too, though the original version was only capable of firing a single 10.7 by 58mm R black powder cartridge before it needed to be reloaded. The introduction of the Lee Enfield quickly showed the Russians that they needed a rifle capable of firing multiple rounds before reloading, and by the time World War II rolled around, the Mosin Nagant had been modified to the point where it could accept a 5-round magazine. Still not as good as the Enfield, and nowhere near as good as the Garand, but good enough for standard issue. The Mosin Nagant also had a huge upside. It was reliable. Red Army engineers had modified the original design so much that by 1930 they managed to properly calibrate its sights and shorten the gun a few inches from its original length of 51 inches. Combined with the 5-round magazine, this new variation of the gun was named the Model 9130 and was given to millions of Red Army conscripts during the war. Jams were rare, and the rifle was extremely accurate, so much so that it could be fitted with a PU rifle scope to transform it into a makeshift sniper rifle. The 9130 wasn't perfect. For example, a later version, the M44, introduced a permanently mounted bayonet that could fold away when it wasn't needed. However, that version of the gun didn't see wide production. As for the 9130, almost 20 million of them had been produced by the end of World War II, making it one of the most widely used rifles in history. And with that, our examination of 6 of the most important rifles of World War II is complete. Before moving on to the rifles used in the Vietnam War, we should note that several of these guns were still very much in use by the time the Vietnam War started in earnest. The M1 carbine, for instance, was introduced into Vietnam by the French and became a regularly used rifle on both sides during the war. Still, the conflict in Vietnam marked the last hurrah for battle rifles that were so common in World War II. However, this category of rifle did see one last use on the American side, at least for a short while, with the first gun on our Vietnam list, the M14. Earlier, we mentioned that Germany's Gewehr 43 served as the inspiration for several rifles that came after it. The M14 was one of those rifles. Often viewed as a rifle that combined the best features of the M1 Garand with the M1 carbine, the M14 was the last battle rifle that Springfield Armory produced for the United States military. A selective fire rifle, it officially became the standard issue for the U.S. military in 1957. Though not all branches were quick to adopt it. The Marine Corps, for instance, didn't start using the M14 until 1965. With a magazine capacity of 20 rounds, it could hold more than twice the bullets of the M1 Garand that it replaced, and at 44.3 inches, it was a comparable length with its 875-yard range, meaning that troops could kill at a higher distance with the M14's 7.62 by 51mm NATO rounds. There was just one problem: it was heavy. At just over 12 pounds with equipment, the rifle was difficult to lug around. But the weight was even more of a problem on the battlefield, especially once it was switched to full auto mode. The idea here was that the M14 would be a replacement for several American guns, the Garand and the Browning automatic rifle included. But its weight made it extremely difficult to handle in full auto mode. Add to that some malformed bolts and a weak receiver, and it's perhaps no surprise that the M14 fell out of favor in 1964 for the rifle that's up next on the list. But its story didn't end there. though some commentators consider the M14 a failure, with national interest going so far as to call it an oversized M1 carbine. The rifle found a second life after Vietnam. It was still used in basic training up until the mid-1970s, and its variants became favorites of snipers for years afterward. The M14 also served as the basis for the M21 and the M25 sniper rifles. So the rifle wasn't completely useless, it just wasn't fit for purpose in Vietnam, which is where our next gun comes in, the M16. With the weighty M14 needing to be replaced and assault rifles becoming the norm in military combat, the US needed something better. They found it in the M16, which was selected as the replacement for the M14 in 1964. Weighing in at just 6.4 pounds, the rifle has variable magazines with 20 and 30 round versions available, and could achieve a practical rate of fire between 40 and 100 rounds per minute. It was easier to handle thanks to its lower weight, making its full auto mode practical in the jungles of Vietnam. And though the 5.56 by 45mm round it fired had less stopping power than the M14's bigger rounds, they were still effective. In 1964, the M16 entered the Vietnam War for use in the jungle environments, and by 1969 it had replaced the M14 as the standard issue rifle for the United States military. There was a lot of love about the rifle too. Reinforcements around the magazine holder led to fewer loading issues, while a chrome-plated bore made it sturdy. It also used fiberglass rather than wood, one of the first American-made guns to do so, leading it to weighing less than the M14 and perhaps being a little sturdier. But compromises were made. Military Today says the original version of the M16 had a 460-meter effective range, just over half that of the M14. And according to National Interest, some veterans of the Vietnam War preferred the M14 because of its sheer stopping power. Still, the rifle proved extremely popular, with total worldwide production of it and its later variants reaching about 8 million. But some will tell you that it wasn't the best assault rifle to make its way to the Vietnam War. That title may go to an equally famous Russian equivalent, the AK-47. Toward the end of World War II, the Nazis pioneered the development of the STG-44, the world's first assault rifle. It entered the war in 1942 and was produced until 1944, being rolled out to German troops during that year. The rifle offered increased firing power, which might have been useful to the Germans at the beginning of the war when they were resource-rich and could afford to expend enormous amounts of ammo. But by the time the STG-44 entered the fray, Nazi Germany was on its last legs, with major supply difficulties often meaning that soldiers switched it out for other rifles. Still, it was a huge advancement, and it caught the attention of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin wanted a better assault rifle for the Soviets in the wake of World War II, and the task of designing it fell to Mikhail Kalashnikov. Inspired by the Germans' work on the STG-44, he got to work on what would become the AK-47, which was accepted by the Soviets in 1947 and became their rifle of choice a couple years later. Capable of firing a 7.62mm round with a curved magazine that held 30 rounds, the AK-47 was a revelation. It became one of the most popular shoulder weapons in the world, fated for its reliability, even if the rifle was less accurate than the semi-autos that had come before it. But we know what you're thinking. The AK-47 was a Russian weapon, so what was it doing in Vietnam? The simple answer is that the Soviet Union, along with China, funneled weapons into North Vietnam because they wanted to encourage the spread of communism throughout Asia. Thus, the weapon essentially became standard issue for the North Vietnamese Army, or the NVA, along with the Viet Cong and various smaller military groups that joined to fight off the American threat. That usage led to the AK-47 having an enduring legacy, with nationalistic and guerrilla movements often adopting it as their weapon of choice. As much for its symbolism as its practicality, over 100 million AK-47s have been made, only half being built in Russia, and you could argue that America's development of the M16 was a direct result of this rifle's use in Vietnam. Beyond this Russia-provided weapon, the NVA and its affiliates tended to use whatever rifles they could get their hands on, in some cases manufactured crude copies of those rifles for their troops. So we turn our attention back to the rifles their opponents used, with our next entry being standard issue for the forces that often aren't credited with their role in the Vietnam War, the L1A1 self-loading rifle. Though the Vietnam War is often seen as an American conflict, the US has some help from forces deployed from Australia and New Zealand, with the former joining the conflict in 1965. At its peak, the Australian contingent in Vietnam numbered 8,300 men, most of whom were armed with a rifle of Enfield design, the L1A1 self-loading rifle. The British-made version of Belgium's FN-FAL rifle, the L1A1 was first produced under license in 1954 and was in service of the Australian Army until 1988. It measured about 46.5 inches with a long 21-inch barrel and weighed 11.02 pounds when empty, giving it similar specifications to the M14 that the US rejected midway through the Vietnam War. Like the M14, it fired the 7.62 by 51mm NATO round, though its effective range of 547 yards was shorter. However, unlike many of the other rifles used in the war, the L1A1 was semi-auto only, making it the closest rifle, at least in terms of operation, to those used in World War II. But even a semi-automatic rifle can be deadly in the right hands. In fact, We Are the Mighty claims that the NVA feared Australian troops more than they feared the Americans, likely because the Aussies used many of their favored ambush and booby-trapping techniques against them. And even when the opposing troops came face-to-face, as they did at Firebase Coral Balmoral and Bin Ba, the Australians had a habit of coming out on top. So the L1A1 may be seen as somewhat outdated in comparison to its American equivalents in the Vietnam War. Nevertheless, it was clearly effective, even if some of the tales of the NVA fearing the Aussies are slightly embellished. And it was far from the only rifle seemingly inspired by those used in World War II to see regular use in the war, the M2 carbine. While American troops were getting kitted out with the latest and greatest in their country's military technology, the country's South Vietnamese allies had to make do with rifles that were used in World War II. The M1 Garand and the M1 carbine were both common rifles for the South Vietnamese military, or the SVA. With the former also being used by the few South Koreans who entered the war, the SVA also used another version of the carbine, the M2. The M2 carbine had been considered something of a stopgap rifle for the Americans. Developed in 1944 as a direct response to the fully automatic weapons coming out of Germany, the rifle is essentially an automatic version of the M1 carbine. It could fire faster, achieving a cyclic firing rate of 750 rounds per minute, and had a reinforced butt to go along with its larger magazine. But it barely saw any use during World War II. It was a feature of the Battle of Okinawa, but the war was practically over by the time the M2 carbine was finished. It would later see much heavier use in the Korean War, being especially useful for laying down suppressing fire to counteract ambushes, which is likely why the SVA adopted it for Vietnam. The M2 carbine also saw some use among American soldiers, with some preferring it to the M14 and the M16, as both of those newer rifles had occasional teething problems. In particular, the US chopper crews and special forces had an early preference for the M2 carbine. Still, it was eventually phased out, though it stands as an extremely portable rifle that saw heavy use and was something of a bridge between the semi-automatics of World War II and the assault rifles used so heavily in the Vietnam War. And it's perhaps there that we see the biggest difference in the rifles used in World War II compared to Vietnam. In the former, bolt-action and revolutionary semi-automatic rifles were the weapons of choice, with fully automatic rifles coming so late in the conflict that they didn't become emblematic of the war. But by the time the Vietnam War rolled around, fully automatic rifles, or at least rifles that offered the option between semi and fully automatic, were the standard. World War II rifles were still used, especially by the NVA and the Viet Cong, both of which often had to scavenge what they could find until they started receiving direct support from the Soviet Union. The 11 rifles discussed here were among the most important used in the conflict. However, there were so many more, so let us know if there's a rifle that should have made this list but didn't, or at least one that didn't get the attention it deserves in the comments below.